So there was nothing exceptional about the British involvement in slavery in the 17th and 18th centuries.
That answer is incorrect.
What was exceptional and extraordinary was that toward the end of the 18th century, partly because of Enlightenment views, mainly because of Christian views, the idea that owning other human beings as property began to be questioned on principle.
That answer is incorrect.
And so in 1787 you get the creation of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in England. I think Denmark was the first state in Europe to abolish the slave trade within its limited territories.
That answer is incorrect.
Britain followed 3 years later, 1807. And then in 1833, the empire abolished slavery as an institution within its territories. So let me just make this clear, because at the moment, in recent years, we've been encouraged in Britain to look again at the horrors of slavery in which our ancestors were involved for 150, 200 years, as if nothing had changed. So the fact that Britain was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish the slave trade and then to abolish slavery, and it then led the world in suppressing both of those, as I said, from Brazil across Africa to Malaysia. That was extraordinary. No other state had done that before. No other states had done that before, certainly not in Africa, certainly not in Asia, nor among the indigenous peoples of North America.
That answer is incorrect.
Let's be very clear. The reason there is no slavery in the world today, I mean, there's a lot of slavery in the world today, but in the parts of the world where there's no slavery, is because the British Empire ended it. That's why there is no slavery. That is...
So,
well,
that's going to
look, the fact that you are uneducated about history doesn't mean it's funny. So let me educate you now. Let me educate you now. Let me educate you now. I know that the woke narrative and the anti-Western narrative on slavery... Oh, you're not practicing free speech very well, are you? You're not practicing free speech very well, are you? The moment I say something you don't like, you're not practicing free speech very well, are you, sir?
Thank you.
I thought you were all about free speech. How about you let me finish my point?
Let's finish the point, and then I'm going to...
Now,
and then I will
the
bring
woke
it to
narrative and
audience.
the anti-Western narrative on slavery is there was no slavery, and then the British or the Americans came along and they started slavery.
That answer is incorrect.
Slaves were the first good that were ever traded between human beings. Ever.
That answer is incorrect.
They were the first good ever traded. Native Americans had slaves, Ottomans had slaves, African had slaves. Everybody had slaves.
That answer is incorrect.
The reason there is no slavery in the West is the British Empire, having practiced slavery for a long time, like everybody else, ended it. Not only that, the British Empire then spent a tremendous amount of blood and treasure to force the Middle Eastern slave traders, with the trans-Saharan slave trade being much worse than the transatlantic slave trade.
That answer is incorrect.
In terms of the number of people who were killed, in terms of the way that they were treated, in terms of how long it lasted, it was much worse. And we spent a tremendous amount of blood and treasure to stop it. That's the true history of slavery.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not.
These 3 videos will deal with something very scary. But first, they start with a very bad false premise. The idea that their opponents don't believe that slavery started before Europeans got involved in the 1800s. This is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. By the way, the only reason they're saying this is to try and make themselves feel like they're not guilty of anything. But if you went to court for murder and then you said, I did not invent murder, I don't think anyone in court is going to say, "You're right, you didn't invent it, you could go home, sir." The only time you're guilty of something is if you invent it. This is not the defense that I expect to be held by a people who think they have the monopoly on morality. This is the type of defense I expect from a serial killer. But speaking of serial killers, I'll call this defense the Richard Ramirez defense.
People in this day and age are brainwashed and programmed like a computer at being nothing more than puppets. This nation, this country is founded in violence. Violent delights tend to have violent ends. Madness is something rare in individuals, but in groups, people, and ages, it is a rule. Killing is killing, whether done for duty, profit, or fun. Men murdered themselves into this democracy.
People in this country. You're in the ranks of Charlie Manson, Ted Bundy. You claim you didn't commit these murders, but you're right in there now as far as everybody else is concerned.
Serial killers do on a small scale what governments do on a large one. They are a product of the times, and these are bloodthirsty times.
For anyone who's creeped out by that guy, I apologize. I hope you're just as creeped out by people who try to defend the slavery of Africans by saying the same stupid stuff that they were saying, the serial killers.
In 1619, when the first slaves came to Jamestown, it existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner. Slavery.
So the argument here is what? There's war between Native Americans. I hope that this argument explains that Christopher Columbus also engaged in slavery, and I want to see a real defense, not, hey, some people had wars against each other.
Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
Wait a minute, you're forgetting another continent over there. There seems to be two continents that are not being highlighted, and also it wasn't the entire continents. I'll get back to how many people can actually be involved in slavery.
The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe.
Another meaningless point. The word slave is an English word, and there's several other countries that were, in your own words, involved in slavery, and a lot of them didn't speak English.
Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks.
They also enslaved blacks, Byzantines, whites, Indians, and other Arabs. What's your point?
Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural.
Yeah, of course he considered it natural, because just like your side, he's trying to justify it. But it was not common in the world. In fact, I'll get back to it, but it was not as common as you think.
The slave master model was just how the world operated in the great philosopher's day.
That answer is incorrect.
Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery.
I think this is a good time to say this. Well, first of all, slaves are a very expensive product, and you can't just hold someone without rope, without chains, without some system put in place to hold them. As far back as we can go, human beings go back hundreds of thousands of years, and we do not have evidence of them being slaves hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's nonsense. The whole Egypt thing, there's a difficulty there because a lot of those captives were soldiers, and a lot of them would be freed after one generation. So I don't know why you brought that up. Also, if we look at the Romans and the Greeks and all these people, they were going back and forth with slavery. They weren't 100% like, oh yeah, it's cool, let's just keep doing it. There were people, the philosophers, who would talk against slavery. You ever heard of Dio Chrysostom? He opposed slavery outright. We read, whereas Aristotle defended the appropriateness of slavery and Seneca derided only its cruelty, Dio Chrysostom vehemently opposed any argument in favor of keeping slaves. And he did this in the 1st century.
As renowned historian John Steele Gordon notes from time immemorial, slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved.
That answer is incorrect.
Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery.
That answer is incorrect.
I love how this video is mask off. She's not even saying the Western world. She's saying white people. White people were the first people to end slavery.
In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War.
In 1590, Hideyoshi Toyotomi abolished slavery in Japan. And this edict was mainly against, take a guess, white people, the Portuguese, who had come to enslave their people. After many protests from the natives, Hideyoshi decided to take action officially in law. Obviously, slavery continued underground, and it also continued in other forms that were not particularly mentioned. But this type of slavery continued even after the abolition of slavery in the Americas that they're talking about. Portugal and the Japanese slave trade. Document 1, Edict of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1587. In 1587, the Japanese ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi demanded the trade in Japanese slaves by the Portuguese in Japan be stopped and required the Portuguese to free the Japanese they had brought, promising to return the value in silver of each freed slave. This appeared as part of a series of edicts restricting the spread of Christianity and the activities of European missionaries in Japan. One of the reasons behind Hideyoshi's decision to issue the anti-Christian edict was the practice of slavery by the Portuguese. There are 3 other kinds of kingdoms that I can bring up. I can bring up the Kingdom of Congo, which banned the trade of slaves out to the Americas, but because of the overwhelmingness of Europeans coming to fetch slaves, they had to just engage in it because it didn't work. I can talk about Ashoka, who basically banned any violence against any man or animal, but switched slavery to servitude. I can bring up the late Roman period where they banned the most egregious forms of slavery. But again, just to be fair, let's not include these ones.
Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated.
The way you just laid it down, it doesn't seem that complicated. It seems like everyone was evil and then a new type of human came along with some bright ideas and got rid of slavery like no one else in the past had even dreamed of, because everyone was so evil. It doesn't seem too complicated to me.
No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless.
Now, this is a ridiculous statement. No one stands guiltless. What about the slaves? Do they not stand guiltless? Are they as guilty as their masters? Or what about the Khoisan, who didn't engage in slavery until modern times in very small cases? And what about the Zulus who didn't engage in slavery? What about the several hundreds of thousands of tribes that were hunter-gatherers that did not engage in slavery? You know, those tribes that the super generous white man decided to genocide out of existence because of how magnanimous they are. After slavery, some of the groups, 1900s, look up Congo, Belgian Congo.
Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few.
Well, maybe the reason you're not taught about that is because they're, as you said, complicated empires who might be misrepresented by people like you who would pretend that none of their people ever wanted freedom for those people. For example, some Muslims led the Zand Rebellion, which was a slave rebellion against the Arabs trying to free black slaves, or the rebellions against of the Kingdom of Congo against the Portuguese slave traders, or anywhere. You can pick so many places. Apparently, history is complicated when it comes to doing good things, but when it comes to bad things, it's not that complicated. Everyone who's brown does bad things, and then white people think about these situations and, they go one by one, checking the situation and understanding deep thought.
Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon. And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise.
In the 1500s, Theodore de Bry made some engravings of the Kingdom of Congo. Now, looking at this cartoon mockery of Africans and comparing it to de Bry's images, you can see that they far exceed the expectation of this artist. The idea that the people in Africa did not live in paradise, or at least virtual paradise as Earth can get, is a lie. They lived in virtual paradise before the Europeans came over. Some kingdoms were messed up. There was wars. This does not mean that the Europeans did not destabilize further. Not only do we have images showing the Asante, the Kingdom of Congo, Great Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Egypt, Ethiopia, Chad, and all these other places in some of the height of their civilization. We also have descriptions from European sources that say that gold was so abundant in Africa that Africans didn't actually value gold, called lumaje, and then separate the male from the female, the latter being most prized for its color and brightness. These lumaje are found along all the coasts of Congo, but those of Luanda are finest, being transparent and in color somewhat like the chrysolite, with other kinds not as greatly valued. It must be remembered that gold, silver, and other metals are not valued nor used as money in these countries. And so it happens that with gold and silver in abundance, either in mats or in coin, yet nothing can be bought except with Lumache.
I wish any of this were true, but it's not.
Imagine speaking so arrogantly about a civilization or system of civilizations that you know nothing about. The funny part is, if we go and compare what this video was about, like we check, it's quite obvious that this is the denigration of black people. But let's go with it, see if she goes back to slavery and how awesome white people are.
It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors.
There's so much going on in this one small 10-second clip that I don't know where to start. First of all, they sold slaves. Yeah, that's how they got rich. So this claim that there were no rich civilizations in Africa after you've spent this whole time claiming that they sold people is stupid. Secondly, a mirror is trivial if you got a whole bunch of mirrors. It's not trivial if you don't have a mirror. And also, if you don't have gin, it's not trivial. But this idea that they only sold them for gin and mirrors is stupid. Just on the fact that why would, so if we go to Africa, we're gonna find like 1,000,000 stacks of gin and mirrors. This is stupid. And then, of course, what about the European? Surely they didn't go, let's trick these people and give them things that are worth nothing for slaves. Or are they perfect for what they did? Their role in slavery is one of, passerbys.
Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
Sadly, she's correct about this. The values of the people being sold, the value of their lives was very low, mainly because they were war captives who tried to kill and overwhelm the women of the other civilizations, such as the Bangala or any other group of people. They didn't have tons of prisons to just lock people up, so they would just be like, let's just sell them to the Portuguese. Now, here's the sad part. When the free slaves started being sold, the African countries protested. When this happened and they started shutting down their coasts, the Portuguese forced themselves and would go around official documents. Remember what I said earlier about not mentioning official documents that were sent to Portugal and then to the Dutch when the Dutch were replacing the Portuguese, because they kicked them out because they didn't want to abide by the laws of the anti-slavery laws made by the Kingdom of Congo. The Portuguese went and got criminals in the empires going against the law to go and fetch slaves, even of royals. Now, I know you're not going to suggest that the Kingdom of Congo valued lives so little that they would sell their own daughters to slavery, a king selling their daughter to slavery. And you know what happened? They argued with the Portuguese and brought some back. They went to Brazil and brought some slaves back. Here's a letter by Queen Njinga to the officials in Portugal. Sir, Your Highness should know how our kingdom is being lost in so many ways that it is convenient to provide for the necessary remedy, since this is caused by the excessive freedom given by your agents and officials to the men and merchants who are allowed to come to this kingdom to set up shop with goods and many things which have been prohibited by us, and which they spread through our kingdoms and domains in such an abundance that many of our vassals, whom we had in obedience, do not comply, because they have the things in greater abundance than we ourselves. And it was with these things that we had them content and subjected under our vassalage and jurisdiction. So it is doing a great harm not only to the service of God, but the security of peace of our kingdoms and state as well. And we cannot reckon how great the damage is, since the mentioned merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives, because the thieves and men of bad conscience grab them, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom, which they are ambitious of. They grab them and get them to be sold, and so great, sir, is the corruption and licentiousness that our country is being completely depopulated, and your highness should not agree with this nor accept it as in your service. And to avoid it, we need from these kingdoms no more than some priest and a few people to reach in schools, and no other goods except wine and flour for the holy sacrament. That is why we beg of your highness to help and assist us in this matter, commanding your factors that they should nor send here either merchants or wares, because it is our will that in these kingdoms there should not be any trade of slaves nor outlet for them. Concerning what is referred to above, again we beg of your highness to agree with it, since otherwise we cannot remedy such an obvious damage. Pray our Lord in his mercy to have your highness under his guard, and let you do forever the things of his service. I kiss your hands many times. Many of the people kneel keenly, desirous as they are of the wares and things of our kingdom, of your kingdom, which are brought here by your people, and in order to satisfy their voracious appetite, seize many of your people, freed and exempt men, and very often it happens that they kidnap even noblemen and the sons of noblemen and our relatives, and take them to be sold to the white men who are in our kingdoms, and for this purpose they have concealed them, and others brought during the night, so that they might not be recognized. And as soon as they are taken by the white men, they are immediately ironed and branded with fire. And when they are carried to be embarked, if they are caught by our guards, then the whites allege that they have bought them, but they cannot say from whom, so that it is our duty to do justice and to restore to the free men their freedom, but it cannot be done if your subjects feel offended as they claim to be. By the way, the King of Portugal did respect some of these, but obviously not fully and not in the whole context, and eventually slavery returned. There was some period where they could control slavery in a good way because they had control of the shores, but this didn't last long. But this is the one thing that the Japanese and the Kingdom of Congo had in common very early, which, by the way, other kingdoms in the world tried to do as well, but couldn't do it when they were overwhelmed by the Portuguese. So, the idea that the official state, by the way, if you want to say official means you have stamps or whatever, this was officialized in a Christian Congo state, seen by emissaries and other bishops or whatever from Europe. So this isn't some whatever statement. This is some official thing that was given to the Portuguese as an official law of the country. So this claim that America and the West was the first and Britain were the first places to do this is bunk. It's nonsensical.
Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate that I could find.
Yep, 700,000 slaves in Africa. And I wonder what business they're supplying such a giant market of slaves. Well, let's give one example from 2021. The US Supreme Court has ruled that food giants Nestle USA and Cargill can't be sued for child slavery on African farms from where they buy their cocoa. 6 African men alleged that they were trafficked from Mali and forced to work on cocoa farms in Ivory Coast. Yep, they're doing slavery because they're getting funded by Western companies. Do people not understand? You can't remain poor and have slaves in your country unless those slaves are working for offshore companies.
Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated.
Wow, so many false statements in one short time again. First of all, Europeans didn't just end up in the United States. That's a good slip of the, trying to slide insidiousness of your speech to try and make sure that it's like, oh, look how small the number of people who were shipped to America was. There was 10.7 million people who survived the dreaded passage, Middle Passage, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, South America, to be sold as slaves. Only 388,000 made it to America. The rest died on the way there or survived by overpowering their slavers. Secondly, that thing you said that the transatlantic slave trade started in Africa. What? Are you trying to say that Africans started the transatlantic slave trade? Because that sounds like an admission that Africans went to America first. First of all, the transatlantic slave trade started with Native Americans being shipped from America to Europe, so that has nothing to do with Africa. Secondly, there were some Africans and Native Americans that were being shipped back and forth. This idea that the transatlantic slave trade starts with Africa is stupid. And obviously, you're an extremist, even amongst extremists.
African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then. And no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that.
The reason we hear nothing about that is because it's not true. Russia has a huge slavery problem, and it's a quote unquote white country. Had you said Western, you might have gotten away with something, but you said white country because obviously obsessed with white people. Not only that, there are literally Nigerians being shipped to places like Italy as sex slaves. There's sex slaves being shipped to all kinds of European countries, including Russia. So the idea that slavery has stopped in moving from one continent to another is fake. There are Koreans right now working in America as sex slaves who have literally been arrested. Look it up. They've been arrested for trafficking people from Korea all the way to America, taking away their IDs and stuff like that. The idea that there's no slaves in America right now is dumb. The idea that only Africa has this extremely large number of slaves is dumb. We know about China. We know about all these other places. But obviously, Chinese are not white, right? Because only brown people are evil. And by the way, in all of these countries, these things are officially illegal.
Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago. Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago.
Now you've gone too far. Good people? What good people? You mean good people like George Washington, who kept his slaves and he said that they should be freed only after his wife died? You mean that person? Or do you mean like the other ones who said that even though they should be freed and be considered men, they shouldn't be allowed to vote? Those good men? Or do you mean the good men that killed all the Native Americans and destabilized those regions, continuing the colonization, emptying out New York and sending the Native Americans into Canada, and then continuing there? Those good people.
Why? Because our so-called leaders, black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable. It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business. And who wants that? I'm Candace Owens, author of Blackout for Prager University.
That's right. Obviously, black people are not the victims of America. Being taken from your land and sent to a faraway home to work as a slave, why would that make you a victim? How about not being allowed to vote, or being put in certain areas that are yours only, and then you separated from other people, even if you work for companies like NASA? Why would that make you a victim? Nothing in America makes you a victim. What you have to do is you have to be like this person and fetishize white people. And every time you mention the word white people, you have to have glee in your eyes. And every time you mention anything about Africa, you have to remind people of what a gloomy, dark place it's always been until white people came in there, brought rainbows and sunshine.